Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being here today. I've got two sets of questions, some short ones to get out of the way, and then I'd like to have a discussion through some questions about behaviour change. So getting to the mundane questions, although still important, what money has been spent by your agency or given to others on promoting the yes case for the recent referendum?
Senator, none.
Thank you. I like concise answers. What money has been spent by this agency related to any proposed treaty?
Senator, we were allocated funding for work associated with the Makarrata Commission. That you will see from the budget papers that was in the order of sort of $5.8 million from recollection. I'll get Dr Gordon to confirm that, and he can give you a breakdown of how much of that has been spent. But specifically on treaty, again, none. Our role essentially has been to seek information on processes which states and territories are currently involved in. But I'll get Dr Gordon to give you a more comprehensive response.
Thank you.
Simon Gordon, Acting Group Manager of the Empowerment and Recognition Group. Thanks for the question and good morning.
Good morning.
That's correct. Yes, there's no funding has gone towards a Makarrata Commission. Where the funding has gone in the agency from that $5.8 million has gone towards work on understanding treaty and truth-telling processes underway in states and territories and internationally. And as of 30 September 2023, we've expended $607,000.66 on that.
So what does that involve, spending that money to gain understanding of what the states and overseas people are doing? What does it involve?
It involves some desktop research, but also bilateral meetings with states and territories, or multilateral meetings. There's been a considerable number of bilateral meetings, I think, over the last year. I think it's around about 25 between the agency and our colleagues in states and territory agencies, as well as a few kind of broader ones. Virtual primarily,
yeah.
Yes.
But it's real humans with real humans. Okay. Thank you. Minister Burney has previously... so you've spent 600 and something thousand out of 5.8 million allocated. What are the prospects for the 5.2 million left? What are the plans, rather?
Yep, thanks for the question, Senator. I think, as Minister Burney has stated a number of times, including on the 2nd of August, the government will be considering next steps following the referendum, and that's a process that will happen from this point on. What happens now in relation to that is a matter for government that will be informed by engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and also our ongoing work with the states and territory governments.
Okay, so that goes to my next question. Minister Burney has previously said, prior to the failed referendum, that $1 million had already been spent on the treaty. What is the full figure spent so far on all aspects of that in the past, as well as, you've just told me, zero currently? And what is the full figure spent so far, and how much of it is proposed to continue to spend, given that Prime Minister Albanese has backed away from commitment to pursuing Makarrata and truth-telling?
Thanks for that question, Senator. I'm not aware of that particular statement by the Minister, but the figure that I just gave you is the amount that's been spent on work, looking at the treaty and truth-telling arrangements, and that process going forward for the remainder is what I just outlined as well.
Thank you. A recent NIAA audit found inadequate safeguards and procedures in relation to identifying and dealing with financial risks, including fraud. What plans are being made in response to these deficiencies?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. I'll just get the appropriate person up.
Thank you for your question, Senator. Yes, the report outlines 7 recommendations for improvement in relation to our broader risk and fraud compliance risk management. We have developed, in response to that, an implementation program, making a number of changes to address all of the recommendations. We have accepted all of the recommendations. We have completed a number of actions through that, and we're on track to have closed out all of those recommendations by the end of this financial year.
So can you list the recommendations, please? What areas? I want to get a feel for the reason for that is that NIAA told me recently they can't investigate corruption, which includes fraud. So I wanted to find out who can and does.
So the recommendations, the first recommendation was that NIAA fully implement its risk management policy and framework, including the conduct of assessments of enterprise risk and undertaking risk assessments when developing business plans, policies and undertaking specific activities. The second recommendation was that the NIAA conduct risk fraud assessments regularly and...
Sorry, conduct what?
Fraud risk assessments regularly and develop and implement a fraud control plan. The third recommendation was that the NIAA ensure that advisory committee actions are in line with their terms of reference, and that the ARC, being the Audit Risk Committee, annual report to the accountable authority clearly highlight any deficiencies in the risk management control work that have been identified, framework that have been identified. The fourth recommendation is that the NIAA fully implement program and sub-program fraud risk assessments, organisational risk profiles, activity risk assessments and monitor and review fraud risk assessments. The fifth recommendation was that the NIAA implement proactive mechanisms for the detection of provider fraud and non-compliance. The sixth recommendation was that the NIAA ensure that it maintains a record of referrals, the basis of referral assessment, decision-making against transparent criteria, and makes decisions on whether to proceed with fraud investigations in line with the organisational risk appetite. And the final recommendation was that the NIAA monitor and report on resources, timeframes and outcomes of compliance reviews and fraud investigations. Now, those recommendations were made off the back of the assessments made by the NIAA regarding the effectiveness of the control systems and processes that were in place. So it's not that things weren't in place. We did have processes, frameworks and so on, but the conclusion through the audit processes was that they were partly effective and not as complete as they needed to be, hence those recommendations. And since that point in time, I think it's worth noting that the audit report itself was issued in May of 2023, but a program of improvement had already been well underway. Indeed, was already underway when the audit team arrived and were doing their work. Work has been progressing, as I said, and is due for completion to address all of those recommendations by the end of this financial year.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Who can and does investigate corruption? NIAA told me they don't.
No.
The National Anti-Corruption Commission.
Yeah, it does now.
And we can refer.
Well, it does.
No, I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah.
But is there any federal government agency that has a purview on that? And I noticed that NIAA did a lot of this off its own bat. So I'm not trying to single NIAA out.
No. As with many granting agencies within the Commonwealth, NIAA has processes in place to, I guess, both proactively identify issues of non-compliance, fraud and corruption, as well as a responsive mechanism whereby complaints or reports that are received by us are then taken on board and investigated. As part of that process, we make an assessment of the accusation or concern, and then we respond accordingly. In some circumstances, that from the 1st of July means that it might be referred to NAC, to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. In other circumstances, depending on the nature of it, it might be referred internally for further fraud investigation. And then depending on how that investigation goes, it could be referred to the authorities for prosecution, or it could be subject to an ongoing Australian Federal Police, for example, state police forces, or it could be, for matters of non-compliance, referred internally.
Okay, thank you. Miss Broun, could you tell me the main purpose of the National Indigenous Australians Agency, please? What's the main role? What do you hope to achieve?
So I would go to, and it's in the annual report, it's in our executive order, obviously, and that's on page 9 of the annual report if you've got that there, but to lead and coordinate Commonwealth policy development program design, implementation and service delivery, provide advice to the PM and the Minister, clearly, to lead and coordinate closing the gap in partnership with our partners in that regard.
To what was that third one?
To lead and coordinate closing the gap in partnership, yeah. To lead, might just refer to what's in the annual report because I've done a sort of shorthand, if you like, in partnership with Indigenous Australians, and then lead Commonwealth activities to promote reconciliation, build and maintain effective partnerships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, state and territory governments and other relevant stakeholders to inform whole-of-government priorities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and enable policies, programs and services to be tailored to the unique needs of communities, to design, consult and coordinate the delivery of community development employment projects, analyse and monitor the effectiveness of programs and services for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including programs and services delivered by bodies other than the NIAA, coordinate Indigenous portfolio agencies and advance a whole-of-government approach to improving the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, undertake other tasks the Prime Minister and the Minister require from time to time. So that's the executive order.
Thank you. Next question, Minister, is directed to Ms Broun, but it's an opinion in some ways, so maybe you have to answer it. What are the main ways of addressing community needs, and what are the main community needs that you see in remote communities? I've been to every Cape York community and some of the Torres Strait Islands. I've been to a couple of the Northern Territory ones. And it reminds me of when I was a mine manager. Before becoming mine manager, I worked on the coalface as a miner. And when I became mine manager, I was sent to various mines to turn them around. And I'd walk in, and I was told by the previous management, they're lazy, they're incompetent, etc., etc. I gave them accountability and autonomy, and they were wonderful people, the same lazy miners. And so what I see in Cape York communities is people just hungry for autonomy, and ready for it. But they seem to be squashed by what I'll call, and I'm not referring to you, what I'll call the Aboriginal industry, which is white and black, activists, accountants, consultants, lawyers, bureaucrats, academics, politicians. And the real people are just missing out. That's why it's such a pressure.
That's what everyone says about us too. So
well, I think they're right. I agree with them.
So, you know.
So, is there any thought to allocating the money directly to the communities and getting rid of the Aboriginal industry that's feeding off?
So, Senator, thanks for that question, which is very broad-ranging.
It is. Obviously. I just want to start the discussion.
So, obviously, the Closing the Gap national agreement identifies a whole range of areas that we need to do better on, and the Productivity Commission draft review identifies that we need to accelerate that effort as well. And so it does identify some of the gaps. The Minister has also consistently looked at those priorities around jobs, housing, health and education. I hope I've got those four right. That jobs is a really critical element of this, and it goes to your statement as well. In terms of funding the Indigenous Advancement Strategy has a range of ways that happens currently. So there's different programs go to different providers. So one of the ones that I was mentioning in my earlier statement was Indigenous Rangers programs, and the funding that provides to community organisations generally directly. It's about jobs and it's about connection to country and culture as well. So it has lots of elements to it, and currently employs about 1,900 people, with a plan to double that by 2030. So that goes to your points around jobs as well. I might, if there's more to that you'd like answers to, I can get the right people up in terms of housing and jobs.
I was told by a very bright young councillor at Bardu Island, I said, how's the Closing the Gap going? He said, mate, it's not going. While ever they have a Closing the Gap campaign, there will be a gap because people are feeding off the money. It's not the communities. That's what he said bluntly. So in America they have charter schools. I'm just trying to make a parallel and see what you can come up with. Charter schools are where the money goes from the government directly to the community for their school. And then what they found is that instead of going from the government to the bureaucracy, the locals have responsibility and the charter school flourishes because the principal and the parents take responsibility. And I'm wondering if there's a parallel that can happen with the Aboriginal communities, because these are wonderful people, very, very bright and ready to go. They're just held back by bureaucracy in the Aboriginal industry. So is there any thought of giving the people the opportunity to develop their own future? That's a sure way to get accountability.
Sorry.
Kevin Brown, Acting Deputy Chief Executive Officer with responsibility for our regional presence. So obviously throughout Australia, quite unique and complex circumstances. So just
not easy.
Just lay that in relation to the schools, I know education was on yesterday, but certainly across Australia there's...
I meant community things in general, giving more autonomy to the community, not just schools.
The example of the charter schools as an example, we do what the Education Department funds Aboriginal independent schools, so that goes straight to the schools. We actually fund a lot of community as well, not necessarily through a provider, so the communities themselves...
So when you say we fund, the NIAA funds?
Yes. So there's different funding streams that go to, through different pathways. One pathway is actually through to the community organisations as well. So it's not always through to a provider as such. Some communities are incorporated and they will receive the funding directly from us. I
can remember, and I'll finish up with this as the last question, Chair. I'll finish up by saying sometime around about 2012 or 13, I was driving into Canberra listening to the radio, and they'd allocated almost $1 billion back then, which is when $1 billion was $1 billion back then, and they built 15 houses in 18 months. And the people from the Northern Territory, the Aboriginal communities, are saying, give the money to us and let us build them. And I think that was a fine idea. It wasn't, but instead the bureaucrats controlled it, and they got consultants in and workers in, contractors in from southern parts of Australia when the Aboriginals were hungry for jobs. It just didn't make sense. And the outcome wasn't there.
Senator Libby.
Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you.